The arm must come off by sunrise, the 20th, the surgeon said. If we wait any longer, the infection reaches his heart. Raymond DeLuca sat beside the dying man's bed, held his hand, wept real tears, and said nothing. Because Raymond already knew there was no infection. He had paid a surgeon to sew poisoned industrial thread into Adrian's shoulder with his own hands. Every movement, every breath, every desperate antibiotic, all of it was feeding the poison deeper. 20 of the most expensive surgeons in America stood in that room and saw nothing. The only person who saw the truth was the maid nobody looked at twice. If this story moves you, subscribe right now. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels, and let's begin. The night Adrian Moretti nearly died for the first time was a Tuesday in October, and it happened fast the way violence always does, without warning, without ceremony, without the dignity that powerful men believe they have earned. He was walking from his car to the side entrance of his lakeside mansion when the first shot cracked the air. His security detail moved instantly, bodies covering bodies, guns drawn, shouting commands into the dark, but the bullet had already found him. It entered his left shoulder at an angle, punching through muscle and soft tissue before lodging less than 2 inches from a major arterial junction. His bodyguards dragged him inside. He was conscious. He was bleeding. He was furious. "Don't call an ambulance," Adrian said through his teeth. "Call Marcus." Dr. Marcus Webb was one of 4 private physicians on Adrian's permanent payroll. He arrived in 11 minutes, assessed the wound, stabilized the bleeding, and called the only man he trusted for emergency surgery, Dr. Nathan Caldwell, whose hands had reportedly never failed a patient in 31 years of practice. Adrian was prepped for surgery in his own private medical suite on the 2nd floor of the mansion. The suite had been installed 3 years earlier, after Adrian's older brother was killed in a hospital waiting room by a man dressed as a nurse. Adrian had spent $200,000, ensuring he would never be that vulnerable again. The surgery lasted 4 hours. When it was over, Caldwell came downstairs in his scrubs, pulled off his gloves, and shook hands with Vincent Russo, Adrian's security chief, and one of the 3 men Adrian trusted with anything approaching honesty. "Clean," Caldwell said. "Bullet is out. No arterial damage. He should be walking in 3 weeks." Vincent let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 4 hours. "Thank you, Doctor." Caldwell nodded, collected his fee in a sealed envelope, $50,000 in cash, and left the mansion before midnight. That was October 14th. By November 3rd, Adrian Moretti was dying, and nobody in that mansion could explain why. It started with the fever. Low grade at first, the kind a man can fight through with stubborn pride and 2 aspirins. But the fever climbed. By the end of the 2nd week, it reached 103 degrees and stayed there. The tissue around the incision, which should have been healing cleanly, began to change color. It darkened at the edges. It smelled wrong. The skin around the stitches grew soft and discolored in a way that made the medical staff exchange looks they tried to hide from Adrian. Vincent flew in specialists, then more specialists. A parade of physicians moved through the 2nd floor suite with their bags and their credentials and their carefully measured confidence. The first surgeon said it was a deep tissue infection, likely from the original wound. He prescribed a heavy course of antibiotics. The infection didn't retreat. The second surgeon said the first surgeon had misidentified the bacterial strain and ordered a different antibiotic protocol. The third surgeon disagreed with both of them and recommended immediate debridement of the dead tissue. They operated. It helped for exactly 9 days. Then it came back worse than before. The dead tissue spread further along the shoulder. Adrian's arm began to lose sensation in the fingers. His fever returned. His blood pressure dropped and spiked unpredictably. He stopped being able to hold a fork in his left hand. Vincent, who had served Adrian for 14 years and could count on one hand the number of times he had seen his boss genuinely frightened, now saw it every morning when he walked into that room. Not in Adrian's words, Adrian never said he was scared, but in the way his eyes moved when he woke up, searching the room before his face locked into its usual controlled expression. In the way he refused to look at his left hand for longer than a few seconds. By the time the 7th surgeon arrived, they had run every test the suite could accommodate. Cultures, blood panels, imaging, tissue biopsies. The results kept pointing to infection, but the infection made no biological sense. It did not respond to treatment. It did not localize. It did not behave like any infection any of these physicians had encountered in decades of practice. By the 14th surgeon, the mood inside the mansion had shifted from urgent to something quieter and more frightening. Staff spoke in low voices. The guards stationed outside Adrian's door stood stiffer, eyes harder, because they understood that their world was built around one man, and that man was losing. Raymond DeLuca sat beside Adrian every night. He was 62, silver-haired, with the kind of face that inspired confidence, deep-set eyes, a strong jaw softened by age, hands that had always felt steady when they rested on your shoulder. He had been Adrian's father's most trusted advisor. When Adrian's father was killed, shot 3 times in a restaurant booth, during what was supposed to be a routine meeting, Adrian was 17 years old and suddenly responsible for a criminal empire he barely understood. Raymond was the one who sat across from him the next day and said, "I will not let them take this from your family." He had kept that promise. For 20 years, Raymond guided Adrian through every war, every negotiation, every moment when the organization threatened to collapse. He taught Adrian how to read people, how to manage fear, how to identify betrayal before it fully formed. Every night since the surgery, Raymond sat in the chair beside Adrian's bed, sometimes talking, sometimes just present. He held Adrian's right hand, not the damaged shoulder side, the good hand, and told him he was going to be fine. He brought him food from his favorite restaurant when the fever allowed Adrian to eat. He read to him from the sports pages because Adrian had once told him he missed following the Cubs when life got too complicated. And every night, after Adrian fell asleep, Raymond would sit a little longer in the quiet room, and his expression would shift into something unreadable, watching the machines, watching the slow rise and fall of the chest, watching and waiting with the practiced patience of a man who understood that some things simply required time. Nobody noticed. On the night the 18th surgeon concluded that the condition was progressing beyond conventional treatment, Vincent finally spoke the word that everyone had been carefully avoiding. Is he going to lose the arm? The surgeon, a man named Dr. Harrington, who had flown in from Johns Hopkins and charged $10,000 simply for the consultation, said, "If we cannot stop the spread in the next 72 hours, amputation becomes the safest option to prevent systemic sepsis." Vincent stood in the hallway and pressed his back against the wall and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he went back into the room and sat down across from Raymond. "You heard him," Vincent said. "I heard him," Raymond said. His eyes were wet. He pressed his lips together and shook his head slowly, the way a man does when grief has been building too long to contain. 20 years, Vinny. That boy survived everything we survived together, and some piece of bad luck with an infected wound is going to." He stopped, pressed his fist against his mouth. "We find another surgeon. We find the best one in the world, and we bring them here. We've brought 20, Raymond. Then we find the 21st. There was a pause between them. The kind of pause that carries more weight than words. "Okay," Vincent said. 21st surgeon." What he didn't say, what neither man said, was that they were running out of time and they both knew it. The room was a private medical suite, not a bedroom anymore. It had stopped looking like a place where a man lived weeks ago. There were IV stands on both sides of the bed now. A vitals monitor ran constantly, its soft rhythmic beeping the background noise of every conversation. Medical supply cases were stacked along one wall. An oxygen unit sat in the corner, not yet needed but present, the way bad news often is available, waiting. It was in this room that Elena Brooks worked. She had been cleaning the second floor of the Moretti mansion for 6 weeks, hired through a domestic staffing agency that asked no questions and paid no benefits. She was 24 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, with dark circles under her eyes that no amount of sleep had managed to erase since her mother's funeral 4 months earlier. She wore a gray uniform with her name embroidered on the pocket. She carried her cleaning supplies in a canvas bag that she replenished herself because the house manager had told her the supply closet was for full-time staff only. Elena had grown up understanding that certain spaces were not for her. Not because anyone explained it directly, nobody had to. You learned it from the way people looked through you rather than at you. From the way conversations stopped when you entered a room and resumed after you left, as though you were a brief interruption in someone else's story. She had learned to move quietly, to complete her work without drawing attention, and to keep whatever she observed behind her own eyes where it was safe. Her mother, Patricia Brooks, had spent 23 years as a seamstress and fabric repair specialist at a workshop in Chicago's industrial district. Patricia could identify any material by touch, the weight, the weave, the chemical treatment applied to make it resistant to water or mold or industrial wear. She repaired boat covers, commercial awnings, cargo straps, industrial canvas. She taught Elena everything she knew about thread and fabric and the way synthetic materials behaved when exposed to heat, moisture, or chemical stress. What Patricia did not know, or did not know until it was too late, was that the factory regularly used materials treated with industrial compounds that were never meant to contact human skin for hours a day, year after year. She developed a persistent cough in her mid-40s, chronic inflammation in her hands, eventually a lung condition that the doctors gave a clinical name to and the factory's lawyers called coincidental. Patricia died in July. Elena was sitting with her when it happened. She took the job at the Moretti mansion because it paid $12 an hour, which was $4 more than the restaurant where she had worked before, and because she was carrying $47,000 in medical debt that her mother's insurance had declined to cover. She had not chosen this life, but she was practical enough to understand that choice was a luxury, and she could not afford luxury right now. She did not know when she accepted the position that the man in the upstairs suite was a crime boss. She learned it gradually, the way you learn anything in a house like that, through fragments of overheard conversation and the things that people do not bother to hide from employees they have decided do not matter. She had been cleaning the medical suite for 3 weeks when she first noticed the thread. It was a Thursday morning, early, before the medical staff arrived for their daily rounds. She was changing the protective barrier sheet beneath the IV stand when the physician, doing the overnight check, adjusted Adrian's bandaging to prepare for the morning assessment. The wound was partially exposed for a brief moment, long enough for Elena to see the interior of the incision as the outer dressing was carefully peeled back. She saw the stitches. She had changed the linens in that room every day. She had watched the wound through 3 dressing changes. She was never supposed to watch, but she was quiet and small, and nobody thought to tell her to look away. She had seen the medically approved sutures in the supply cases, stacked along the wall. Thin monofilament, nearly translucent, under strong light. Standard surgical thread. What she saw inside that wound was different. The internal sutures, the deeper stitches that should have been dissolving gradually as the tissue healed, were thick, black, tightly braided in a pattern she recognized immediately because she had seen it 100 times in her mother's workshop. It was a diamond braid, a structural braid used in heavy-duty applications, the kind of braid that did not dissolve, the kind designed to last through years of weather and tension and stress. She did not say anything. Not that morning. She went back to her canvas bag and her cleaning supplies and thought about what she had seen while her hands moved automatically through the familiar work. That afternoon, she found an excuse to stay in the supply room longer than usual. She looked at the suture cases on the wall, the legitimate ones, the sealed sterile packages that the physicians used. She read the labels: polyglycolic acid, absorbable, clear or violet, nothing black, nothing braided. Nothing that matched what she had seen inside that wound. She went home that night and sat in her small apartment with a cup of tea she didn't drink and thought about her mother. About the way Patricia could identify a fabric treatment by smell alone after enough years of exposure. About the particular chemical odor that came off certain industrial threads that had been dyed using compounds banned in domestic manufacturing, but still available through unregulated importers. About how Patricia had complained for years about the smell in the workshop, the headaches it caused, the way it clung to your clothes and your hair, and eventually your lungs. Elena had smelled something in that room, faint, masked by the antiseptic smell of the medical equipment. But underneath it, during the brief moment when the wound was open, something chemical, something that did not belong in a surgical suite. She went back the next morning. She was careful. She was not a doctor, and she did not pretend to be one. She did not touch anything she was not supposed to touch. But she was observant in the way that people who have spent their lives being overlooked tend to become observant, because watching carefully is sometimes the only power available to you. Over the next 4 days, she watched the tissue damage. She paid attention to exactly where it was worst. She noted the path it followed, the direction in which it seemed to progress. And what she observed, what none of the physicians had mapped because they were focused on the infection itself rather than its geography, was that the damage followed the thread exactly, not randomly distributed through the tissue, the way a systemic infection would spread, not radiating outward from a single entry point, the way contaminated surgical tools would produce. The worst damage was precisely where the braided black thread went deepest. The tissue died in a pattern that traced the suture's path through the muscle. Every time Adrian moved his shoulder, which he was encouraged to do, because immobility in a healing shoulder can cause permanent stiffness, the braided thread moved with the muscle. And whatever was in that thread moved with it. On the 5th day after she first noticed the thread, the 19th surgeon gave his assessment. The infection was progressing faster than anticipated. The antibiotics were having no measurable effect. His recommendation was a full course of intravenous treatment with a broader spectrum protocol, and if improvement was not visible within 96 hours, amputation should be seriously considered. Elena stood near the door of the supply room with her cleaning supplies and listened. She thought about her mother. She thought about all the times Patricia had gone to the factory management and said, "Something is wrong with these materials." And all the times management had said, "You are a seamstress, Patricia, not a chemist. You are here to repair fabric, not diagnose it." She thought about what it had cost Patricia to keep quiet. She thought about what it was going to cost this man if she kept quiet now. The 20th surgeon arrived 2 days later. His name was Dr. Ferris, and he was considered one of the top infectious disease specialists in the Midwest. He reviewed every test result, every prior treatment, every tissue analysis that had been run over the preceding weeks. He spent 4 hours in the room. He consulted by phone with 2 colleagues from research hospitals in Boston and Atlanta. When he came downstairs, he walked straight to Vincent, and he said, "I need to speak with you privately." They went into the study. Vincent came back out 11 minutes later. His face was a wall. He found Raymond sitting in the hallway, and he said, "Ferris says the arm has to come off. He says if we wait another 24 hours, we risk systemic sepsis reaching the bloodstream. He wants to operate tomorrow morning." Raymond closed his eyes. He pressed both hands flat against his knees. He breathed through his nose, slow and controlled. Then he opened his eyes and nodded. "Whatever gives him the best chance," Raymond said. "Whatever it takes." Vincent nodded and went back upstairs. Raymond sat alone in the hallway for a long moment after that, and his expression, in the empty hallway with no one watching, did something complicated and dark that had nothing to do with grief. Elena was upstairs when Vincent delivered the news to Adrian. She was cleaning the corridor outside the suite, not inside the room, not where she was supposed to be, but close enough that she heard it through the partially open door. "Tomorrow morning," Vincent said. "Ferris says it's the only option." There was silence from inside the room. "Get out," Adrian said. His voice was quiet, not angry, something beyond anger. Something that was working very hard to stay controlled. "Adrian," I said, "get out, Vincent. I need 5 minutes. Just give me 5 minutes." She heard Vincent's footsteps approaching the door, and she moved back toward her supply cart and bent over it as though she were retrieving something, and he walked past her without looking at her, because she was the maid, and the maid was furniture. She stood in the corridor for a long moment. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed that with some surprise. Given what she was about to do, she expected her hands to be shaking. She picked up her canvas bag and walked to the door of the suite and knocked. There was a pause. I said, "I need." "Sir," Elena said, "I'm not the doctor. I'm Elena. I clean the 2nd floor. I'm sorry to disturb you, but I need to show you something about the stitches. Longer this time." "Come in," Adrian said. She opened the door. He was sitting up against the headboard, his right hand gripping the edge of the mattress, his left arm bandaged and elevated on 2 pillows. He looked at her the way powerful men often look at service employees, a brief registering glance that categorizes and then dismisses. The maid. A small woman in a gray uniform, nothing requiring his full attention. "Make it quick," he said. "I'm in the middle of..." "The tissue damage follows the thread," Elena said, "not the infection pattern." He stopped. Not just stopped talking. He stopped in the way people stop when something lands differently than expected, when a word hits a nerve before the brain has finished processing it. "What did you say?" he asked. "The internal sutures," Elena said. She did not apologize for interrupting him. She did not wait to be invited to continue. She had spent 24 years waiting to be invited, and she had watched what patience had cost her mother. "They don't match the materials in the supply cases. They're braided nylon, black thick, the kind used for heavy industrial canvas. And the worst tissue damage, the places where the skin is dying, follows exactly where those stitches go deepest." Adrian stared at her. She had his full attention now, not the categorizing glance. The real attention, the kind that meant the man behind the authority was actually listening. "You're the maid," he said. "Yes. You've been in medical school?" "No. My mother repaired boat covers and industrial canvas for 20 years. I grew up around thread." She paused. "The stitches inside your wound are not medical sutures. And I think whatever is in them has been poisoning the tissue every time you move." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze. Her hands were still not shaking. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." He called for Vincent. When Vincent came in and Elena repeated what she had said, his reaction was exactly what she had expected. Adrian. I know what she is, Adrian said. I asked what she knows. Are these different things to you? Vincent's jaw tightened. He looked at Elena. His expression was not hostile exactly. It was the expression of a man who had spent his career calculating risks and was currently deciding whether this small woman in a gray uniform represented one. How would you even know what surgical sutures look like? Vincent asked. I've been in this room every day for 3 weeks, Elena said. I've seen the supply cases. I've seen the labeled packages. I've watched 3 dressing changes because nobody told me to look away. The thread inside that wound does not match anything in those cases. Not the color, not the weight, not the braid pattern. And the chemical smell, Adrian asked. He said it quietly, testing. She looked at him. You noticed it too. I've been lying in this room for 3 weeks, he said. I noticed something underneath the antiseptic. I thought it was the medication. It might be the dye, Elena said. Industrial black dyes certain older formulas. The kind still used by unregulated importers have a specific chemical signature. My mother could identify them by smell after enough exposure. I grew up in a workshop that used them. The smell in this room is close to that. Vincent said, Adrian, we cannot make a medical decision based on... I'm not making a medical decision, Adrian said. I'm making a test. Get me a fragment of the thread. One fragment, removed by whoever is doing the morning assessment, sent to an independent laboratory for analysis tonight. He looked at Elena. If you're wrong, you pack your cleaning supplies and leave, and we never have this conversation again. If you're right, he paused. If you're right, then we have a much larger problem than an infection. Elena said, if I'm right, you should probably also figure out who replaced your surgical sutures. Because it wasn't the infection that put that thread in your shoulder. The room went quiet. The kind of quiet that fills up with the sound of implications landing one by one, like stones dropped into still water. Vincent looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at the bandaged arm resting on the pillows. His expression did not change. He was too disciplined for that, too practiced in the art of revealing nothing. But something shifted behind his eyes. Something that Elena recognized, because she had seen it in her mother's eyes the day the doctors finally confirmed what Patricia had suspected for years. The particular expression of a person discovering that the damage they are carrying was not an accident. Get me the fragment, Adrian said. Adrian, tonight, Vincent. Vincent left the room. Elena was about to follow him. Her place was in the corridor, not in this room, not in this conversation when Adrian said, What's your name? Your full name. Elena Brooks. How long have you been here? 6 weeks. Did you need this job? She looked at him. My mother died in July. I have $47,000 in medical debt and no other family. Yes, I needed this job. He nodded. It was not a sympathetic nod. It was the nod of a man filing information. Processing. You understand that if you're right about this, the people responsible for it are going to be very motivated to ensure you never speak to anyone about what you found. I've been thinking about that, Elena said. I've been invisible my whole life, she said. People with power have always assumed that people like me don't see things clearly. I think that assumption is the only reason I'm still here to tell you about it. Because whoever did this never thought to worry about the maid noticing. She picked up her canvas bag and walked to the door. Get some sleep, she said. You're going to need your strength for what comes next. She left him there in the half-dark of the medical suite, surrounded by machines that had spent 3 weeks measuring every vital sign except the one that actually mattered. The toxicology report came back at 4:17 in the morning. The fragment of thread, a single strand removed by the overnight physician under Vincent's direct supervision and sent immediately to a private laboratory, was identified as 12-ply industrial maritime nylon. It contained a compound found in a category of slow-release chemical agents used in certain industrial preservation treatments. The compound was not acutely toxic in small doses, but in sustained contact with living tissue reacting to body heat, to movement, to the natural moisture of a healing wound, it released its chemical load gradually, continuously, invisibly. Every time Adrian moved his shoulder, the thread flexed in the muscle. Every flex released a fresh dose. The tissue died in a slow, continuous, medically inexplicable pattern. Inexplicable only if you didn't know the thread was there. The physician who took the call from the laboratory looked at the results for a long time before he went to find Vincent. Vincent stood in the hallway, reading the report for even longer. Then he went to Raymond's room and knocked on the door. Raymond answered in a robe, silver hair flattened on one side, eyes adjusting to the light. They found something, Vincent said. What? In the thread. Vincent handed him the report. The sutures from the surgery. They weren't medical sutures. Raymond read the report. His face went through something careful concern, then shock, then the controlled outrage of a man who has been wrong. He handed the report back. Caldwell, he said. The name came out like a verdict. That bastard, that absolute. He stopped, pressed his hand over his mouth. His eyes were wet again. Adrian needs to know. He already knows, Vincent said. He ordered the test. Last night. Vincent paused. He was watching Raymond's face very carefully. A maid told him about the thread. Raymond blinked. A maid. The one who cleans the second floor. Elena Brooks. Vincent kept his voice flat and even, uninflected. She noticed the sutures didn't match the supply inventory. She recognized the braid pattern from her mother's workshop. Raymond looked at him. Something moved briefly across his face too quickly to name. Remarkable, Raymond said. Isn't it? Said Vincent. There was a pause between them. We need to find Caldwell, Raymond said. We do, Vincent agreed. He took the report and walked back down the hallway. And he thought about the way Raymond's eyes had moved when he said the maid's name. That small, quick, involuntary calculation, the kind of movement you cannot train out of a man, no matter how many years he spends managing his own face. Vincent had spent 14 years learning to read Adrian Moretti. Before that, he had spent 12 years learning to read men who lied for a living. He knew that look. He filed it away behind his own eyes, in the place where he kept the things that were not yet evidence, but had stopped feeling like coincidence. Upstairs, Adrian Moretti lay awake in the pale gray hour before dawn, his left arm still elevated, the fever not yet broken but no longer climbing. He stared at the ceiling and thought about a woman in a gray uniform who had noticed what 20 surgeons had not, who had carried her mother's hard-won knowledge into a room full of expensive machines and told the truth to a man who terrified half of Chicago. He thought about what kind of person does that. And then he thought about who, in his entire organization, his entire world built on loyalty and fear and 20 years of careful architecture, who would have needed him to die slowly enough to look like an accident. The list was shorter than he wanted it to be, and one name sat at the top of it with a weight that felt less like suspicion and more like recognition. He closed his eyes. He did not sleep. The toxicology report sat on the table between Vincent and Adrian like a loaded weapon. Nobody wanted to pick up first. It was 5:30 in the morning. The fever had dropped half a degree, not enough to celebrate. Enough to confirm that stopping the movement of the shoulder, which they had done immediately after the lab results came back, had slowed whatever was happening inside the tissue. The physician on overnight duty had said it carefully, the way doctors say things when they are not yet sure if the news is good or simply less bad than before. Adrian read the report a second time, then a third. His right hand held the paper steady. His left arm lay immobile on its pillows, wrapped, elevated still. 7 strands, he said. That's what the lab estimates, Vincent said, based on the tissue cross-section images. 7 individual strands of industrial maritime nylon, each one loaded with that compound. Every time you moved your arm. I know what happened every time I moved my arm. Adrian set the report down. I've been living it for 3 weeks. Vincent said nothing. Who knew I was going into surgery that night? Adrian asked. I've been running the list since 4 in the morning. Vincent pulled out a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and set it on the edge of the bed. Caldwell, Marcus Webb, who made the call. Me, Raymond. Your driver, because he had to bring the car around. The security team that was on the front entrance, 4 men. The 2 staff members who prepared the suite. That's 12 people. Marcus Webb is in the hospital. Appendix. He's been there since last week, I already checked. So 10, Vincent confirmed. Adrian looked at the list. His face was still. We're not going to talk about the name at the bottom of that list? Vincent didn't answer right away. That itself was an answer. Raymond has been by my side for 20 years, Adrian said. His voice was flat, not defensive, processing. He sat in that chair every night. He held my hand, he cried, Vincent. Real tears, I know. People don't fake that. Some people do, Vincent said quietly. The very good ones. The silence between them had weight. It pressed down on the room the way silence does. When 2 men are standing at the edge of something, neither wants to step off. I'm not making a move on Raymond based on a lab report and a feeling, Adrian said finally. We need proof, not circumstantial, not gut. He looked at Vincent. Find Caldwell. Already looking. Find him faster. Vincent picked up the report, folded it back into his coat, and stood up. At the door, he paused. Elena Brooks. What do you want me to do with her? Adrian thought about it. About the woman who had stood in his room at 10 o'clock at night with her canvas cleaning bag and told him the truth when 20 specialists had not. Who had not flinched when he looked at her. Who Whoever did this never thought to worry about the maid noticing. She stays, Adrian said, and she's not invisible anymore. Make sure the staff knows. Vincent left. Adrian stared at the ceiling in the growing morning light and thought about Raymond DeLuca sitting in the chair beside his bed, night after night, reading the Cubs' scores, squeezing his hand, performing grief with the patience of a man who had been waiting for a particular outcome and simply needed it to arrive on schedule. He thought about that for a long time. And the thing that sat in his chest was not anger, not yet. It was something older and more painful than anger. It was the particular devastation of recognizing that the enemy you never saw coming was wearing the face of the person you loved most. By 7 in the morning, Dr. Rebecca Sloan was standing in the doorway of the medical suite. She was 41 years old, Northwestern Memorial, board certified in surgical oncology and reconstructive medicine, with a reputation that had nothing to do with wealthy private clients because she had never worked for any. She had received the call at 5:45 from a hospital administrator who told her only that she was needed for an urgent consultation at a private residence, that the case involved potential surgical malpractice, and that she would be compensated at 3 times her standard rate. She had almost said no. She said yes because the administrator used the word malpractice, and Dr. Sloan had spent most of her career being angry about what malpractice did to people who couldn't afford lawyers. She stood in the doorway of the suite and looked at the setup, the machines, the IV stands, the supply cases, the armed guards she had passed in the hallway, and she said, "I need the room cleared. Every non-medical person out. That includes security." Vincent, standing behind her, said, "We don't leave the patient unattended." "You're not a physician," Sloan said without turning around. "I am. If I'm operating in this room, I need sterile conditions, and I need to be able to work without someone standing over my shoulder with a gun. Those are my terms. Take them or find someone else." There was a pause. Adrian said, from the bed, "Clear the room, Vincent." Adrian, Vincent. The guards filed out. Vincent was the last to leave. He pulled the door almost closed behind him, leaving a gap of approximately 2 inches, which Sloan noted and did not comment on. She walked to the bed and looked at Adrian with the direct, impersonal assessment of someone whose job required her to see past the person and into the problem. "Tell me what happened," she said. "Everything. Starting from the night of the injury," Adrian told her. He was precise and unemotional, the kind of patient physicians rarely encountered, someone who had trained himself to observe and report without editorializing. He described the surgery, the recovery timeline, the onset of the fever, the parade of specialists, and finally the lab results from the previous night. Sloan listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "The lab report. I need to see the original, not a summary." He pointed to the nightstand. She read it twice. Then she said, "The tissue damage pattern. Is there imaging?" 3 separate sets. I need all of them." For 40 minutes, she reviewed everything: the imaging, the culture results, the antibiotic history, the tissue biopsies. She moved through the data with the systematic efficiency of someone who had already formed a hypothesis and was testing it against the evidence rather than searching blindly. Finally, she looked up. "The good news," she said, "is that your arm does not need to come off." Adrian closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then opened them again. "The bad news," Sloan continued, "is that I need to go back into the shoulder and remove every strand of that thread, clean the damaged tissue, and replace the contaminated sutures before the compound does any more damage. That is a 2 to 3 hour procedure. It carries its own risks, and I cannot promise full restoration of function until I see what the tissue looks like underneath." "When?" Adrian asked. "This afternoon, if you want. I don't see a reason to wait." "I don't either." He looked at her directly. "Why are you willing to do this? You don't know me. You don't know what I am." Sloan held his gaze. "I know what was done to you, and I know that whoever did it used surgical materials as a weapon, which means they used my profession as a weapon. That makes it my problem." She paused. "Also, whoever is responsible is probably still out there, which means this is likely not their last attempt." The room was quiet. "No," Adrian said, "it probably isn't." Elena was mopping the corridor outside the second-floor supply room when Vincent found her at 8:15. She heard his footsteps and kept working. She had learned long ago that stopping what you were doing when people approached. You looked like guilt, and she had nothing to feel guilty about. "Elena Brooks," Vincent said. "Yes," she said, without looking up. "Put the mop down." She put it down and looked at him. His expression was unreadable in the way of men who had practiced being unreadable. For so long it had become their natural state. But his eyes were doing something, a calculation, an assessment that she recognized. He was deciding something about her. The lab confirmed everything you said, he told her. She nodded once. She did not say I told you so, though part of her wanted to. Mr. Moretti wants you relocated to the East Wing guest room. Your cleaning duties are suspended pending. I don't want a guest room, Elena said. Vincent stopped. I want to keep working, she said. I want to be useful. If whoever did this finds out that I'm the one who identified the thread, giving me a guest room and surrounding me with guards, is just going to confirm to everyone in this house that I matter to Mr. Moretti, which makes me a target. She picked up the mop. Let me keep cleaning. Let me keep being invisible. That's how I've stayed safe this long. Vincent looked at her for a long moment. You've thought about this, he said. I've been thinking about it since last night, Elena said, while I was mopping the third floor. Something that might have been respect moved briefly across his face. He wasn't used to it, that was visible. He was used to people asking him for things. Safety, money, protection. This woman was asking him to let her keep scrubbing floors. Fine, he said. But you check in with me every 3 hours. You don't go anywhere alone. And if anything feels wrong, I'll tell you, Elena said. You'll tell me immediately, Vincent said. Not after you've thought about it for 5 days. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. He left. She went back to mopping. The surgery happened at 2 in the afternoon. Dr. Sloan worked for 2 hours and 47 minutes. She removed 7 strands of contaminated thread, each one photographed and cataloged before removal. She cleaned the damaged tissue with the careful, methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that the goal was not speed but completeness. She found 2 additional strands deeper in the muscle that the imaging had not clearly identified. She removed those too. When she closed, she used verified medical sutures from the sealed packages in the supply cases, each one documented by batch number and manufacturer. She photographed every step. When she came out of the room, Vincent was waiting in the hallway. 9 strands total, she said, not 7. 2 more embedded in the deep muscle layer. All removed, no systemic spread to the joint or bone. He's going to recover full function with physical therapy. She paused. The contamination was deliberate and sophisticated. This was not a mistake by a careless surgeon. Whoever chose that thread knew exactly what they were doing. They chose a compound that mimics natural infection and degrades slowly enough to allow multiple failed treatment attempts before the patient dies. It would have looked in a death certificate like an aggressive postoperative infection resistant to antibiotic treatment. She said it the way physicians often said terrible things in the clinical language that contains the horror inside a structure of fact. It would have looked like bad luck, Vincent said. Yes, Sloan said, exactly like bad luck. She handed him the documentation, every photograph, every strand measurement, every lab notation. I'm going to testify to all of this if needed. I want that understood. It's understood. She picked up her coat. He has a strong constitution. The fever will break by tonight. He'll be weak for a while, but the deterioration has stopped. She looked at Vincent with the direct assessment she had used on Adrian. Make sure the person who did this does not get another opportunity. That's my job, Vincent said. Then do it well, she said and left. By 6 in the evening, the fever had dropped to 99.2. By 8, it was 98.8. Adrian ate a full meal for the first time in 3 weeks. He ate it slowly, carefully, in the particular way of someone rediscovering that the body's basic functions are not things to take for granted. Raymond came to the room at 8:30, as he did every evening. He brought the sports page. He sat in the chair. He looked at Adrian with the expression of a man seeing something he had not expected to see and managing the surprise well. You look better, Raymond said. Your color is better. New surgeon, Adrian said. She took out all the old sutures and replaced them. Apparently there was a contamination issue with the original material. Raymond's face did the thing it did, the careful progression through the appropriate emotions. Concern, anger, relief, contamination. From Caldwell? We're still looking into it. That son of a bitch. Raymond shook his head, pressed his jaw tight. His hands resting on his knees were perfectly still. Adrian, I want to find him myself. I want to be the one who... I know, Adrian said. I know you do. He watched Raymond's face. He had spent 20 years learning to read that face, the face that had guided him, taught him, steadied him through every crisis of his adult life. He looked at it now with the specific attention of a man who was seeing it for the first time. And it was like looking at a painting you had walked past 1,000 times and suddenly noticing the thing hidden in the background that had been there all along. Raymond believed Adrian did not know. That was the thing Adrian could see now clearly in the careful performance of his grief. Raymond was still waiting, still managing, still playing the role of the devastated father figure, confident that his plan was simply delayed rather than unraveled. Get some rest, Adrian said. We'll talk more tomorrow. Raymond squeezed his hand. I'm not going anywhere. I know, Adrian said. And that was the truest thing either of them said that night. The money appeared in Elena's account on a Thursday. She was in the supply room restocking her cart when her phone buzzed with a bank notification. She looked at it. $14,000 had been deposited into her checking account from a wire transfer she did not initiate and could not trace. She stared at the notification for a full 10 seconds. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went to find Vincent. She found him in the security room on the ground floor, which she had never entered before. She knocked on the open door. He looked up from the monitors. Someone put $14,000 in my account, she said. She held up her phone and showed him the notification. I didn't touch it. I'm showing you right now, so there is a record that I showed you the moment I saw it. Vincent was on his feet before she finished the sentence. He looked at the notification, then at her, then at the notification again. When the notification just came through. 3 minutes ago, he took out his own phone and made a call. He spoke quickly, quietly, turning partially away from her. When he ended the call, he looked back at her with the expression of someone assembling pieces of a picture they do not like. Our finance people say the transfer originated from an account opened 48 hours ago under your name and social security number, he said. It's a shell account. Someone created it and funded it specifically to send you money. To frame me, Elena said. To frame you, Vincent confirmed. She felt something cold settle in her chest. Not panic, she had been expecting something like this since the night she spoke in Adrian's room. The people responsible for what happened to Adrian were not going to leave a witness standing quietly in a corridor with a cleaning cart. She had known that. She had been waiting for it. There's more, Vincent said. He looked at her steadily. One of the housekeeping staff reported finding a piece of contaminated thread in your locker in the staff room. Elena said, I have never been in the staff locker room. I keep my personal items in my car because I was told on my first day that the locker room was for full-time employees only. I know, Vincent said. Then why are you looking at me like that? I'm not looking at you like anything, he said. I'm telling you what happened so you are not blindsided by it when other people bring it up. He paused. Not everyone in this house is going to respond to this the way I am. She understood what he meant. She understood it within the hour. 3 of Adrian's senior associates, men who had spent their careers turning rumor into action, were circulating through the house by mid-afternoon with the story already formed and hardened. The maid had planted the evidence. The maid had invented the discovery to get close to Adrian. The maid was the most sophisticated plant they had ever seen, a young woman with a sympathetic story, enough technical knowledge to sound credible, and the emotional intelligence to perform concerned innocence while running an assassination scheme that had already killed better men than her. One of the associates, a man named Caruso who was built like a refrigerator and had the social subtlety of one, stopped Elena in the second-floor corridor at 2 in the afternoon and stood close enough that she had to stop walking. Interesting timing, he said. Nobody Maid shows up right when the boss is in trouble. Says she noticed something 20 surgeons missed. Suddenly she's protected, she's moved around the house, she's trusted. He tilted his head. You understand why that looks a certain way. Elena looked at him. She did not step back. I understand that it makes you uncomfortable, she said. That a person you had already dismissed as irrelevant turned out to be relevant. I understand that's disorienting. Caruso's expression tightened. Watch your mouth. Tell me specifically what I said that was inaccurate, Elena said, and I'll watch it. He leaned closer. The account. The thread in your locker. An account I never opened, funded by a wire I didn't send, containing thread I've never had access to, she said. Those things were put there by someone who was very motivated to make me look guilty, which tells you 2 things. 1, I'm telling the truth. And 2, whoever you're actually looking for is worried enough about me to spend time and money trying to discredit me. She held his gaze. You've been in this business long enough to know that innocent people don't get framed. Only dangerous witnesses do. Caruso stood there for a moment with his jaw set. Then he stepped aside. She walked past him and kept her breathing steady until she turned the corner. Her hands, she noticed, were finally shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and kept walking. The security footage review took 4 hours. Vincent ran it himself, pulling every camera from the staff areas over a 72-hour window. What he found, or rather what he did not find, was simple and conclusive. Elena Brooks did not appear on any footage entering or exiting the staff locker room. Not once, not in 6 weeks of employment. The person who did appear, briefly, at 11:47 the previous evening, moving through the corridor adjacent to the locker room, with the relaxed, unhurried gait of someone who belonged in the building, was a figure in a dark jacket whose face turned away from the camera at the precise angle required to avoid identification. It was not conclusive, but the specific awareness of the camera angle, the exact degree of deflection required to stay out of frame, was not something a person did accidentally. Vincent brought the footage to Adrian at 8 that evening. Adrian watched it twice. "How many people in this house know the camera positions well enough to do that?" he asked. Vincent did not answer. He didn't have to. The list of people who knew the house's security infrastructure with that level of detail was short. It was built entirely of people who had been in Adrian's orbit long enough, trusted enough, to learn which corners were watched and which corners were dark. "Find the account trail," Adrian said. "Follow every wire, every digital signature, every IP address that touched the creation of that shell account. I want to know who built it. That will take time." Then Start looked at him. "And bring Elena here." She came to the room at 9 o'clock. She was still in her uniform. She had been working for 14 hours. Adrian looked at her and said, without preamble, "Someone is trying very hard to destroy your credibility. Which means someone in this house is very afraid of what you know." "I know," Elena said. "Are you afraid?" She considered the question honestly, which he noticed. She did not immediately say no, the way people said no when they wanted to appear brave. "Yes," she said, "but not of the right things. I'm not afraid of being fired or hurt or framed. I'm afraid of not being believed. I've spent my whole life not being believed by people with more authority than me. My mother spent her whole life not being believed." She looked at him. "That's the only thing that actually frightens me." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "Then let me tell you what I believe," he said. "I believe the account was manufactured. I believe the thread was planted. I believe you are the most honest person in this building, which at this particular moment makes you the most dangerous." He paused. "I also believe that the person who tried to kill me and the person who is trying to frame you are the same person, which means we have a common problem." "We do," Elena said. "I want your help identifying the thread's origin," he said. "You know these materials better than anyone in my organization. I want you working with the investigator I'm bringing in. Officially. Paid. With my protection." She looked at him steadily. "I'll help you find the truth," she said. "But I need you to understand something. If the truth leads somewhere, you don't want it to go to someone you trust, someone you love. I'm not going to soften it for you." Adrian met her eyes. "I know exactly where it leads," he said quietly. "I've known since 4 in the morning." The room went very still. "Then why haven't you moved on it?" she asked. "Because knowing and proving are different things," he said. "And because the man I'm looking at has been like a father to me. And because even now, even knowing what I know, some part of me is still waiting for it to be wrong." It was the most honest thing Elena had ever heard a powerful man say. She sat down in the chair, beside the bed, not Raymond's chair, the one on the other side, and said, "Tell me what you need." And for the first time in 3 weeks, Adrian Moretti felt something in his chest that was not fever or dread or the particular exhaustion of dying slowly. He felt, with careful and unfamiliar precision, that he might actually survive this. Not just the wound. All of it. Claire Bennett arrived at the mansion at 7 in the morning on a Friday 3 days after Dr. Sloan's surgery. She drove herself, which Elena noticed immediately. No driver, no partner, no federal escort. Just a woman in her mid-40s with a weathered leather briefcase and the kind of eyes that had seen enough dishonesty to recognize it in under 30 seconds. She was a federal financial investigator with 12 years of experience tracking corruption through Chicago's shipping unions, and she had agreed to come because Vincent had called in a favor she had been waiting to collect for a long time. She shook Adrian's hand and looked at his arm and said, "You look better than I expected for someone who was almost murdered by his own surgeon." "I feel better than I expected," Adrian said. "Sit down." She sat. She opened the briefcase and pulled out a legal pad and a pen that had clearly been refilled many times. "Walk me through everything. Not what you think happened. What you know happened. Evidence, timeline, names. We build from what's real." Elena was in the room because Adrian had asked her to be. She sat in the chair on the far side of the bed and listened and said nothing, which was a skill she had refined over 24 years and which now felt less like invisibility and more like strategy. Adrian talked for 40 minutes. Claire wrote everything. She did not react to the names, the money figures, the description of the surgery, the lab results. She wrote and occasionally asked a question so precise that it reoriented the entire direction of what Adrian was saying. When he finished, she looked at her notes for a long moment. Then she said the thread. Use Elena identified it as 12-ply maritime nylon with a diamond braid. Where is the thread manufactured? Elena said, not manufactured here. The diamond braid pattern and the dye compound, the specific formulation, it's associated with unregulated importers. The domestic manufacturer stopped using that dye formula in 2009 because of EPA restrictions. Anything still using it is coming from overseas through channels that don't go through standard customs inspection. Claire looked at her directly for the first time. You know textile chemistry. My mother repaired industrial canvas for 20 years. She developed a lung condition from unregulated materials before anyone admitted the materials were dangerous. I know what I know because of what it cost her. Claire held her gaze for a moment. Then she wrote something on the pad. The unregulated import channel for that type of material in the Chicago area runs through the Calumet River Warehouse District, Claire said. I've been building a case on 3 warehouses down there for 2 years. They're connected to fraudulent shipping manifests, union bribery, illegal factory operations. She paused. If someone bought that thread in Chicago, I know where they bought it. The room was quiet. You've been working this area for 2 years, Adrian said carefully, and you're telling me now. I'm telling you now because 2 years ago, you were part of the ecosystem I was investigating, Claire said. She said it without aggression, as a statement of fact. Things have changed. The person who tried to kill you and the operations I've been tracking are connected, which means for the first time our interests align. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. You trust me? No, she said. But I trust the evidence. And right now the evidence is pointing in the same direction for both of us. She closed the legal pad. I need 2 things. I need Elena to look at the warehouse records with me. And I need you to stay out of it long enough for me to do this legally. Legally, Adrian repeated. The word sat in his mouth like something unfamiliar. If we do this your way, Claire said, you get 1 man, maybe 2. And the network that made it possible continues operating. If we do it my way, we take the whole structure down. Everyone who was involved. Every corrupt official, every bribed inspector, every factory owner who knowingly bought toxic materials. She paused. Including the people who ignored your mother's complaints, she said to Elena. Elena went very still. What do you mean? Elena asked. Claire reached into the briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. She set it on the bed between them. The factory where Patricia Brooks worked. It's in our case files. Not as a primary target, as a connected entity. They purchased materials from the same import network. The complaints your mother filed, 3 of them, over 8 years are in the factory's HR records, which we subpoenaed 14 months ago. Elena's hands were flat on her thighs. She pressed them down hard. They knew, Elena said. It was not a question. They knew, Claire confirmed, and they buried it repeatedly. Your mother was not an isolated case. There are 23 former employees from that factory in our case, files with documented health conditions consistent with chemical exposure. The silence in the room lasted a long time. Adrian looked at Elena. Her face was doing something complicated and quiet, the particular expression of a person receiving confirmation of the worst thing they had already suspected. The thing they had made themselves stop believing, because believing it with no power to act on it was its own kind of destruction. Elena said finally, her voice was level. Tell me what you need me to do. They went to the warehouse district the following Tuesday morning. Adrian did not go. He remained at the mansion under Dr. Sloane's continued care, which was the condition Claire had required, and which Adrian had accepted with the visible difficulty of a man for whom staying still during a crisis went against every instinct he possessed. Vincent went in his place, with strict instructions from Claire that he was there to observe and not to touch anything. Elena went because she could read the materials. The warehouse on the south bank of the Calumet River was a legitimate-looking commercial storage facility, the kind that processed dozens of invoices a day and relied on the sheer volume of paperwork to obscure the ones that didn't bear close examination. Claire had a federal warrant. She had 2 agents with her who knew how to move through a warehouse without making it look like a federal warrant operation. They found the purchase record in 40 minutes. 1 spool of 12-ply maritime nylon, diamond braid, black dye, purchased 14 weeks earlier. Paid for in cash, which was unusual enough to have been noted in the warehouse manager's personal ledger, not the official one. The handwritten one kept in the bottom drawer of the office desk, which Claire's team had been looking for since the beginning of the morning. The price paid 50 times the standard market value for that quantity of material. Elena looked at the entry and felt the number settle in her chest like a stone. 50 times. That was not a purchase. That was a premium for silence, for speed, for the understanding between two people that what they were transacting existed outside the world of invoices and serial numbers. He paid 50 times the value, she said. Because the seller knew what it was for, Claire said, or suspected, and charged accordingly. She photographed the ledger entry. There's a name here. The buyer signed the cash receipt. Elena looked at the signature. Dr. Nathan Caldwell. Written in the precise, controlled hand of a man who had signed his name thousands of times on documents that mattered: prescriptions, surgical authorizations, patient records, and whose hand did not shake even when it should have. He signed his real name, Vincent said from behind them. He sounded genuinely surprised. Arrogance, Claire said, or certainty that this warehouse would never be examined, or both. She closed the evidence bag around the ledger. But there's something else. She walked to the warehouse manager's desk and pointed at the security monitor mounted in the upper corner of the office. It was old hardware, the kind that recorded on a continuous loop and overrode itself every 30 days. The purchase had been made 14 weeks ago, which meant the footage was gone. But the warehouse's external camera system, a newer installation, added 18 months ago after a break-in recorded to an off-site cloud server. We requested the off-site footage this morning, Claire said. It came through an hour ago. She opened her laptop on the desk and turned it to face them. The footage was grainy, time-stamped, wide angle. It showed the warehouse entrance at 2:17 in the afternoon, 14 weeks ago. A dark car pulled up. Two men got out. One of them was Nathan Caldwell. The other one stood with his back mostly to the camera. Silver hair, a measured, unhurried way of moving. The particular posture of a man who had spent decades in rooms where he was always the most experienced person present. Elena recognized him before Vincent did. She recognized him because she had watched him sit beside Adrian's bed every night for 3 weeks, and the way a person holds their body when they believe they are in a safe place, unobserved, at ease, at the center of a plan they control is different from the way they hold it when they are performing grief. The man on the screen was not performing anything. He moved through the frame with complete ease. He knew exactly where he was going. He placed a hand briefly on Caldwell's shoulder, the gesture of an authority establishing reassurance, the gesture of someone who had arranged this and was confirming to his instrument that everything was proceeding correctly. Then he turned slightly, just for a moment, and the camera caught 3/4 of his face. Raymond DeLuca. Vincent made a sound that was not quite a word. Something below language. From somewhere deep in the chest, the sound a person makes when a thing they had been trying not to believe becomes impossible to disbelieve. He stood there for a full 10 seconds. "Play it again," he said. Claire played it again. They watched Raymond DeLuca walk through the frame a second time, unhurried, comfortable, in complete control of an operation designed to kill the man he called his son. He was there, Vincent said. His voice was very quiet. He stood in that room and cried and held his hand, and he was there. He organized the whole thing, and then he sat beside him every night, and he stopped. He pressed both hands flat on the desk and looked at the floor. Elena said nothing. There was nothing to say. This was the kind of moment that required space, the moment when a person's understanding of their own life reorganizes itself around a new truth that cannot be unlearned. "Adrian needs to know," Vincent said finally. "Yes," Claire said. "But how we tell him matters. And what we do next matters more." She looked at both of them. "Raymond does not know we have this footage. He does not know about the warehouse or the ledger or the cash receipt. As far as he is aware, the investigation is still focused on Caldwell alone, who has disappeared and cannot yet be located. That is an advantage we can only use once." Vincent straightened up. His expression had moved through the grief and come out the other side into something colder and more functional. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Claire said carefully, "that a man who is confident his plan is simply delayed, rather than unraveled, will keep performing the role he has assigned himself, and that a performance, under the right conditions, can become a confession." She closed the laptop. "But Adrian has to agree to it," she said, "and it has to be his decision. I won't run this operation around him." They drove back in silence. Vincent's jaw was set for the entire 45-minute drive, and he did not speak once. Elena sat beside him and looked out the window and thought about Raymond DeLuca holding Adrian's hand in the dark. She thought about the specific cruelty of that, not just the plan to kill him, but the choice to be present for his suffering, to watch it, to manage it, to grieve it in front of an audience while privately measuring its progress toward the intended outcome. That was not just betrayal. That was something else. something that required a particular quality of coldness that Elena had encountered before in factory managers who knew what the materials were doing to Patricia's lungs and continued the production schedule without modification. The ability to sit with someone in their pain and feel nothing except the patience of someone waiting for a result. She had always thought that kind of person was rare. She was learning that they appeared everywhere. Power collected itself, because power had a way of selecting for exactly that quality. Adrian received the news at 4 in the afternoon. Vincent played him the footage on the laptop. He showed him the ledger entry and the signed cash receipt. He laid it all out without commentary or interpretation, the way Adrian had asked him to deliver information since the beginning of their relationship: facts first, conclusions after. Adrian watched the footage once. He did not ask it to see it again. He sat with it for a long time. The room was quiet except for the soft beeping of the vitals monitor, which had become such a constant presence in that room that Elena had stopped hearing it. She heard it now, slow, steady, and different. "He raised me," Adrian said. It was not a defense of Raymond. It was an accounting of what was being lost. "I know," Vincent said. "After my father died, he was the only person in that entire organization who treated me like I was capable of leading it. Everyone else was waiting for me to fail. Raymond was the only one who believed I could do it." He paused. "Or so I believed." He looked at Claire. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "I need you to keep Raymond in his role," Claire said. "Don't confront him. Don't change your behavior toward him. Don't give him any indication that you know. Can you do that?" Adrian looked at her steadily. "I've been managing my face in front of dangerous people since I was 17 years old." "This is different," Claire said. "This is someone you love." "Loved," Adrian said. A single word, past tense, that carried the full weight of something being sealed and put away. "Can you do it?" Claire asked again. "Yes," Adrian said. "Tell me the plan." The plan required patience, which was the thing Adrian was worst at, and which Elena suspected Claire knew perfectly well. It also required a specific kind of theater, the construction of a scene in which Raymond would be given the opportunity to expose himself, not through pressure or confrontation, but through the natural motion of a man who believed he was in control of the narrative. Claire spent 3 days preparing it. She coordinated with her federal team, obtained the necessary warrants, verified the chain of evidence. She reviewed every piece of documentation with 2 separate federal prosecutors who agreed that what they had was strong enough to charge, strong enough to convict, but that a recorded admission from Raymond himself would remove any possibility of a successful defense. During those 3 days, Raymond continued to visit Adrian every evening. He brought the sports pages. He sat in the chair. He held Adrian's hand and told him stories about his father, things Adrian had not heard before, small details, specific memories that felt real in the way only real memories can feel. Elena, cleaning the corridor outside during one of these visits, stopped and pressed her back against the wall and listened. Raymond's voice was warm, measured, fully inhabited by the character he had chosen to play. She understood, standing there, why Adrian had been so blindsided. Raymond was not performing a thin imitation of love. He was performing something much more convincing than that, something that might, at some point in the past 20 years, have actually been real and had then been carefully converted into a tool. That was the most frightening version of it. Not that Raymond had never cared about Adrian, but that he had cared enough to learn exactly how to simulate it when the caring became inconvenient. The dinner was organized for a Thursday. Adrian called his senior associates together under the pretext of a recovery update, an opportunity for him to address the organization directly, reassure the people whose loyalty he needed, and present a plan for the weeks ahead while his arm continued to heal. Raymond received the same invitation as everyone else, delivered by Vincent, who had achieved in those 3 days something remarkable. He had continued to treat Raymond with complete normality, including 2 conversations about the search for Caldwell, in which he had provided Raymond with carefully curated information designed to confirm that the investigation was focused entirely on the vanished surgeon. Raymond arrived at the dinner looking comfortable. That was the first thing Elena noticed from her position near the far wall, where she stood with a water pitcher in a role that had been designed specifically to keep her in the room without drawing attention. He arrived looking like a man who had weathered a crisis and was beginning to see the end of it. The particular ease of someone who has been managing anxiety and is now allowing himself to relax because the thing he feared most, discovery, appears to have been avoided. Adrian sat at the head of the table. His left arm was in a partial sling, visible and documented. His face was the controlled, measured expression of a leader addressing his organization. He spoke for 15 minutes about recovery, about the organization's stability, about the investigation into Caldwell. He spoke about the need for accountability. He spoke carefully and with deliberate ambiguity about the evidence that had been gathered. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a sealed evidence bag on the table. Inside it, visible through the clear plastic, was a short length of black braided thread. The lab identified this material, Adrian said. The source has been traced to a warehouse near the Calumet River. The warehouse manager has agreed to cooperate with investigators. He paused. He has agreed to identify the individual who introduced Dr. Caldwell to the supplier. He looked around the table, not at Raymond specifically, at everyone, the way a leader looks at a room. Raymond was looking at the thread. Elena watched him look at it. She watched the calculation happen behind his eyes, rapid, practiced, the assessment of a man running probability trees. The warehouse, the manager, a witness. Caldwell, wherever he was either already in custody or about to be. If Caldwell talked, that warehouse thief is lying about me, Raymond said. The table went silent. The silence was absolute. Adrian turned to look at Raymond with the slow, complete attention of a man who has been waiting for a specific sound and has now heard it. I didn't name anyone, Adrian said quietly. Raymond's face moved through three expressions in less than 2 seconds: realization, recovery, the desperate reach for an alternative explanation, and found none of them adequate. I meant, he started, Raymond. Adrian's voice was not loud. It was the quietest voice in the room. I didn't say the warehouse manager had named anyone. I said he agreed to identify the individual. I didn't say who. The room was so quiet that Elena could hear the man sitting 2 seats from her breathing. Raymond straightened. He set his jaw. He made a decision. She could see it happen. The shift from panic to something harder and more dangerous. The decision of a man who has been caught and is now calculating whether he can still fight his way out. His hand moved toward the inside of his jacket. Elena had been watching his hands the entire evening. She had been watching them because she had grown up watching people's hands, the hands of factory managers reaching for documents to deny, the hands of hospital administrators reaching for phones to call lawyers, the hands of people in power reaching for whatever instrument was closest when accountability arrived. His jacket, Elena said, loud, clear, across the room. Vincent moved before she finished the word. 2 guards moved with him. Raymond's hand was halfway to whatever was inside the jacket when Vincent's hand closed around his wrist, and the 2 guards secured his arms. And the room erupted, chairs scraping back, voices, one person knocking a glass off the table, the specific controlled chaos of a situation becoming exactly what everyone had feared it would become. "Get your hands off me," Raymond said. His voice was cold and hard and completely stripped of the warmth that had inhabited it for 3 days of bedside vigils. Adrian, listen to me, whatever they've told you." Adrian stood up from his chair. He stood slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man whose left arm was still healing, and he looked at Raymond with an expression that Elena would remember for the rest of her life, not anger, not hatred, but the profound, irrecoverable sadness of someone watching the last version of something they had believed in finally and permanently die. "I know everything." The door opened. Claire Bennett walked in with 2 federal agents, both holding credentials. Raymond looked at them. He looked at Adrian. He looked at Vincent, who was still holding his wrist. Then he looked at Elena, across the room, still holding the water pitcher, in her gray uniform, standing where nobody important had thought to look. Something crossed his face. Recognition. The specific, bitter recognition of a man identifying the variable he had failed to account for. "The maid," he said. "Her name," Adrian said, "is Elena Brooks." Raymond said nothing else. They took him out of the room with his hands secured and his silver hair still perfectly in place, which seemed wrong. Somehow Elena had expected the arrest to disorder something about his appearance, the way crisis disorders most people. But Raymond walked out looking exactly as he always had, contained and composed, because men like Raymond had spent a lifetime understanding that composure was the last form of control available when everything else was gone. Caldwell was located at the Canadian border crossing at Emerson, Manitoba 40 minutes later. He was traveling under a false identity, a passport issued to a man named David Rell, a name he had apparently purchased 6 months before Adrian was shot, which meant the planning had been underway long before the ambush in October. He was taken into federal custody without resistance, which the arresting agents described as consistent with a man who had known, somewhere in the back of his mind, that this particular road only had one destination. Adrian sat back down at the head of the table when they were gone. The room was quiet. His associates looked at him, some with shock, some with the careful neutrality of people recalibrating their understanding of events. One or two with expressions that Elena could not read and did not trust. Raymond DeLuca arranged the ambush, Adrian said. He arranged the surgery and the contaminated sutures. He arranged the evidence planted against an innocent employee. He arranged the deaths of the two men from the original ambush team, who were killed to prevent them from identifying who hired them. He paused. He did all of this because he believed my death would create a leadership vacuum that he could fill. He was wrong about several things, but he was right that my death would have created a vacuum. He looked around the table. That vacuum will not be created by a bullet or a poisoned stitch. And it will not be filled by anyone who believes that 20 years of loyalty can be manufactured and then discarded when it becomes inconvenient. The room was very still. We're going to do things differently, Adrian said. He looked at Elena when he said it. She set the water pitcher down on the side table and met his eyes and said nothing, because some things did not require words. The understanding between two people who had arrived at the same place from opposite directions and found, somewhat to their mutual surprise, that the view from there was cleaner and clearer than anything either of them had seen before. Outside, the federal agents were loading Raymond DeLuca into a car. Inside, Adrian Moretti was beginning, for the first time in his adult life, to understand the difference between surviving and choosing to live differently. Elena picked the pitcher back up and refilled the glass of the man sitting nearest to her, who looked like he needed it, and went back to watching the room with the careful, patient attention of someone who had that the most important things were always visible to the people that power forgot to hide them from. The morning after Raymond's arrest, the mansion felt different. Not quieter, it was actually louder in some ways. Phones ringing, associates moving through corridors with urgent footsteps, Vincent coordinating with Claire's federal team on the evidence transfer. But underneath all that activity, something structural had shifted. The way a building feels different after a load-bearing wall is removed. The same rooms, the same furniture, but the air distributed differently, the weight falling in new places. Adrian noticed it at 6 in the morning when he walked to the window of the medical suite for the first time without asking for help. His left arm was in a reduced sling. His shoulder ached with the deep, persistent ache of tissue rebuilding itself, which Dr. Sloan had told him to expect and which he was learning to distinguish from the toxic burn of the previous weeks. That burn was gone. What remained was honest pain, the pain of healing, which at least had a direction. He stood at the window and thought about Raymond. He had done that for most of the night. Not with anger. Exactly, anger would have been simpler. What he felt was more like standing in a room you have lived in your entire life and suddenly noticing that every piece of furniture is 6 inches from where you remembered it. Nothing missing. Nothing obviously wrong. Just slightly, persistently displaced from the version you had been carrying in your memory. He thought about every lesson Raymond had taught him. How to read a room. How to identify the man in a negotiation who was lying. How to project authority when you felt none. How to survive. All of it was real knowledge. All of it had worked. None of it had come free. He understood now what the price had been. Raymond had not taught him those things out of love alone. He had taught him those things because a capable Adrian was more useful than a weak one, until Adrian became capable enough that Raymond's own ambitions required his removal. The student had outlived his usefulness to the teacher. Adrian pressed his right hand flat against the window glass and felt the cold coming through it. "You should be in bed," Elena said from the doorway. He turned. She was in her uniform. She had started arriving at 6 in the morning since the night of the dinner, a habit that had developed without either of them acknowledging it directly. She was carrying her canvas bag and a cup of coffee that she set on the nightstand without being asked. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "I know. I saw the light on when I came in." She did not tell him to go back to bed again. She sat down in the chair on the right side, not Raymond's chair, never Raymond's chair, and wrapped both hands around her own cup. "No," she said. "The other thing." He looked at her. He had noticed in the weeks since the surgery that Elena asked questions that other people didn't ask, not the logistical questions, those he received constantly. The questions about what was happening inside, the ones that required actual answers rather than managed responses. Most people in his life had stopped asking those questions years ago, either because they feared the answers or because they had decided he didn't have any. "It's bad," he said. "Not in a way I can fix by doing something. Just bad in the way that certain truths are bad." The kind you have to sit with. She nodded. She did not offer comfort or reassurance or any of the things people offered when they wanted to close the conversation. She just sat with it, which was its own form of generosity. My mother used to say, Elena said after a moment, that the hardest betrayals are the ones that were also real. That a person can love you and still choose something they want more. That both things can be true at the same time. She looked at her coffee cup. It doesn't make the love a lie. It just makes it insufficient. Adrian looked at her. She was a wise woman, he said. She was a tired woman, Elena said. Wisdom and exhaustion can look similar from the outside. He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile he had managed in weeks, and it felt like a muscle that had been unused long enough to be surprised by the demand. At 8 o'clock, Claire arrived with the full evidence package. She spread it across the sitting room table: warehouse records, the cloud footage, the bank documents tracing Raymond's payments to a series of shell companies, Caldwell's signed cash receipt, the toxicology report, the surgical documentation from Dr. Sloan. 14 weeks of coordinated conspiracy laid out in organized rows on a mahogany table that had previously been used for Adrian's business meetings. The federal prosecutors reviewed everything last night, Claire said. They're charging Raymond with attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, medical tampering, evidence fabrication, and 2 counts of accessory to homicide the ambush team members who were killed to prevent identification. Caldwell is charged with attempted murder, medical malpractice amounting to criminal negligence, conspiracy, and fraud. Adrian looked at the evidence layout. What's the expected outcome? Raymond's attorney is already making noise about a cooperation agreement. He wants to trade information about other criminal operations for a reduced sentence. Claire paused. Some of that information involves your organization. The room got very quiet. What kind of information? Vincent asked. Financial structures, offshore accounts, certain operations connected to the shipping union corruption I've been building for 2 years. Claire looked at Adrian directly. Raymond spent 20 years inside your organization. He knows everything. And he is not a man who will accept 25 years in federal prison if he can negotiate it to 12. Adrian said, what are you asking me? I'm asking whether you want to get ahead of it, Claire said. Whether you want to be the one who cooperates first, on your own terms, rather than having your organization dismantled around you based on whatever Raymond decides is worth trading. She paused. I'm asking whether you're willing to help us take down the whole network. The warehouses, the bribed officials, the illegal factories. All of it. The silence stretched out. Vincent said, Adrian. I heard her, Adrian said. He stood up from the table and walked to the window again. The morning was gray and cold outside. He stood there for a long time, long enough that Claire exchanged a brief look with Vincent, who gave a minimal shake of his head, a signal that meant wait, which Vincent gave rarely and which Claire respected because she had learned to read the room in the 14 years she had spent in rooms exactly like this one. The factory where Elena's mother worked, Adrian said without turning around. The one in your case files. If we move on the full network, does that factory get taken down? Claire said, yes. And the compensation claims? The 23 workers with documented health conditions? They become part of the civil case that follows the criminal charges. With our documentation, they have standing to sue. He turned around. Then yes, he said, tell the prosecutors I'll cooperate. On one condition. The employees, the people who worked inside those operations because they needed jobs and had no idea what they were part of. Dock workers, factory floor staff, warehouse employees. They receive guaranteed immunity before I sign anything. He looked at Claire steadily. They had no choice. I did. That distinction matters. Claire looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote something on her legal pad. I'll get that in writing, she said. She left an hour later, and the mansion began the strange, slow process of reorganizing itself around a new reality. 3 of Adrian's senior associates left within the week. They packed their operations, moved their money, and departed without direct confrontation, which was the organized crime equivalent of a resignation letter. Adrian let them go. He noted their names and their departures with the calm of a man who had already decided that the people who left when accountability arrived were exactly the people he needed to be free of. 2 associates stayed. One of them a man named Benedetti, who had been with the organization for 18 years, and whom Adrian had always considered loyal in the transactional way that most loyalty in his world operated, came to Adrian's sitting room on a Wednesday afternoon and sat down without being invited and said, I want to understand what we're doing. We're cooperating with a federal investigation, Adrian said. We're turning over financial records. We're helping take down operations that we should not have been connected to. And after, whatever survives becomes legitimate. Logistics, property management, the legal operations. Adrian paused. Smaller, cleaner. Benedetti sat with that for a moment. A lot of people are going to say you went soft. Let them, Adrian said. Soft people don't survive ambushes and 3 weeks of slow poisoning. Benedetti almost smiled. He nodded once slowly and said, all right. Then he stood up and went back to work. Elena, meanwhile, was having a separate crisis of her own. It happened on a Thursday, 10 days after Raymond's arrest, when she received a call from the attorney. Claire had connected her with a woman named Patricia Huang, who specialized in labor law and toxic tort cases. Attorney Huang had been reviewing the factory records from Claire's case files. Elena, Huang said you to sit down or de-sitting, Elena said. She was in the small guest room Adrian had prepared for her, not the East Wing room she had initially refused, but a simpler room on the 3rd floor that felt more like a place a person actually lived. She had accepted it finally, 2 weeks after Raymond's arrest, when it became clear that her apartment was no longer safe. And that invisible did not mean untrackable to the people who were watching. The factory records include internal memos from 2011 through 2016, Huang said. During that period, your mother filed 3 formal complaints about material safety. All 3 were acknowledged by management. All 3 were classified as resolved in the HR system. She paused. They were resolved by reassigning your mother to a different workstation, not by changing the materials, not by implementing safety protocols. They moved her desk 6 feet and marked the complaints as addressed. Elena said nothing. There is also an internal memo from 2014 in which the factory's operations manager explicitly notes that certain employees had raised concerns about the dye compounds and recommends, quote, monitoring for further complaints rather than initiating an external safety review, because an external review would trigger OSHA involvement. Elena's hand tightened around the phone. They chose not to investigate, Huang said, deliberately, because investigation meant accountability. My mother filed those complaints when I was 15, Elena said. I remember her coming home after the 3rd one. She came home and she sat at the kitchen table and she said, I don't think anything is going to change. And I told her to keep trying. She stopped. Her voice had done something she hadn't planned. I told her to keep trying. Elena. How many people? Elena asked. She made her voice flat and practical because it was the only way she was going to get through this conversation without breaking into pieces in a room 3 floors above a dead crime boss's chair. You said 23 in the case files. How many total? We're still assessing. But preliminary estimates from the factory's own insurance records suggest between 40 and 60 former employees with health conditions consistent with sustained chemical exposure. 40 to 60 people. 40 to 60 people who had gone to work and come home and developed coughs they ignored, and inflammation they managed, and chronic conditions they named and eventually became unable to outrun. 40 to 60 people whose complaints had been filed and noted and reclassified as resolved while the materials that were damaging them continued to be used, because changing them would cost money and risk was cheaper than accountability until it wasn't. What do we do, Elena asked. We build the case, Huang said. We contact the surviving workers and their families. We document the health conditions, cross-reference them with the factory's material purchase records, and we file a civil suit that the criminal case against the network makes almost impossible to defend. She paused. It won't be fast. These cases rarely are. But with the federal investigation providing the underlying documentation, we have something most toxic tort cases don't have a paper trail that was never meant to be found. Elena sat with that for a moment. My mother kept a journal, she said. Every workday for 11 years, what she worked on, what materials she handled, what symptoms she had. She thought she was keeping notes in case she ever needed to see a doctor and describe the timeline. She stopped. I have all of them. There was a silence on the other end of the phone. Elena, Huang said quietly, those journals might be the most important evidence we have. She ended the call and sat in the small room for a long time. When she went to find Adrian an hour later, he was in the physical therapy session, doctor. Sloan had mandated 45 minutes every afternoon, supervised, painful, non-negotiable. He was working his left arm through a range of motion exercise that Elena could see, from the set of his jaw, cost him more than he was letting on. She waited until the therapist stepped out for a moment. I need to ask you something, she said. Ask, he said, still working the arm. When this is over, the federal case, the cooperation agreement, all of it, what are you going to do with the legitimate companies? He looked at her. Run them as what, a traditional corporate structure? You at the top, everyone else taking orders? He paused the exercise. He looked at her with the particular attention he gave her when he understood that she was not asking a simple question. What are you suggesting, he said. I'm suggesting that you have an opportunity, she said. Not just to convert illegal operations into legal ones, but to convert them into something different entirely. Worker-owned operations, where the people doing the actual work have a stake in what they're building. She held his gaze. You said you want to do things differently. That's what differently looks like from where I'm standing. He was quiet for a moment. That's not how it's done, he said. I know. That's exactly why you should do it. He looked at her for a long time. The arm was resting in his lap. The physical therapist was visible through the door, reviewing notes. The medical debt, Adrian said, your mother's. $47,000. He paused. I paid it, went very still. When, she asked. 3 days ago. I had Vincent find the account and transfer the funds. He met her eyes. I know what you're going to say, do you? Elena said. Her voice was careful and controlled in a way that people who knew her would have recognized as the register just before something important. You're going to say I did it without your permission, he said. You did do it without my permission. I did, he said. And I would tell you I did it because I wanted to and because it was the right thing. But I understand that generosity without consent is still a form of control. So I'm telling you now. And I'm asking what you need from me. She looked at him. Something shifted in her chest, not softened exactly. Reorganized. The careful arrangement of defenses that she had built over 24 years, of being managed and overlooked and acted upon rather than consulted, not dismantled. Because Elena was not a person who dismantled her defenses lightly, but reorganized around the recognition that the man in front of her had just done something she had not expected. He had apologized without minimizing it. He had acknowledged the wrong without explaining it away. He had asked what she needed, instead of telling her what he was providing. I need you to finance an independent foundation, she said. Worker safety, toxic exposure screening, managed by medical professionals, labor advocates, and former factory workers. Not by you, not by your lawyers, not by your organization. Independently governed, independently funded, with a board that I helped select. He said, how much? She told him. The number was large. Not astronomical, she had thought about it carefully, practically. The way her mother had thought about every financial decision with the precision of someone who understood that money was not abstract, but large enough to be real, to be capable of doing what it needed to do. He said, done. I need it in writing, she said. Legally binding. Separate from the cooperation agreement, separate from the federal case, separate from anything that can be clawed back if your assets are frozen. I'll have the attorneys draft it tomorrow, he said. She stood up, thank you. It was not a warm thank you. It was the thank you of a professional closing a negotiation that had gone as intended. He said, Elena. She stopped. You didn't ask me for protection, he said. You didn't ask me for money for yourself. You didn't ask me to make any of this easier for you personally. You asked for a foundation for 40 to 60 people you've never met. I've met them, she said, through my mother. Every story she told me about that factory, that was all of them. He looked at her with an expression she had seen on his face before. In the early morning hours when the fever was breaking and the room was quiet, an expression that had nothing to do with power or strategy, or the careful management of appearances. Just a man looking at another person and recognizing something in them that he had not expected to find anywhere, least of all in his own house. Your mother raised someone extraordinary, he said. Elena stood in the doorway for a moment. She raised someone who paid attention, she said. That's all. She just taught me to pay attention. The next weeks moved fast in the way that legal proceedings always do once they achieve momentum, like a vehicle that has been struggling uphill, suddenly reaching flat ground and accelerating past all the places where it had labored. Caldwell agreed to a cooperation deal of his own within 8 days of his arrest. His attorney had reviewed the evidence and arrived at the same conclusion that rational people consistently arrived at when confronted with warehouse footage, signed receipts, and toxicology reports that fighting it was expensive, slow, and almost certainly futile. Caldwell provided a full account of Raymond's recruitment of him, the communication methods they had used, the specific instructions for the thread selection, and the timing of the surgery relative to the original ambush plan. The confirmation of the ambush connection was the piece that broke the remaining uncertainty. Raymond had arranged the shooting. He had arranged it to be survivable, a shoulder wound, not a headshot, because a dead Adrian immediately triggered succession protocols that might not favor Raymond's position. A dying Adrian, one who deteriorated slowly and convincingly from what appeared to be a tragic postoperative complication, created a different kind of vacuum, a vacuum that could be filled gradually, sympathetically, by the grieving father figure who had been present and devoted through every stage of the crisis. When Adrian was told this detail, the deliberate choice to make him suffer rather than kill him, quickly he received it in silence. Vincent, who was present, watched him process it. "He needed you to die slowly," Vincent said, "so he could be seen suffering with you." "I know," Adrian said. "I know, Vincent," he said it quietly, not angrily, in the tone of a man who has already taken in the full dimension of a thing and does not need help measuring it. The cooperation agreement Adrian signed covered 18 months of financial documentation, 12 connected corporate entities, 7 bribed officials including 2 city inspectors, a customs supervisor, and a federal port authority administrator, and the full operational structure of Raymond's shadow management within the legitimate businesses. The federal prosecutors called it the most comprehensive voluntary disclosure they had received in a white-collar criminal case in the Northern District of Illinois in 15 years. 2 of Adrian's legitimate companies were restructured as worker cooperatives within 60 days of the agreement. The logistics company that survived the investigation, the one that processed shipping contracts through legitimate channels, became the first. Benedetti ran it with a board that included 3 dock workers, a longtime dispatcher, and an accountant named Rosa Marquez, who had been with the company for 11 years and had never been invited to a management meeting. Rosa's first act as a board member was to request a review of the company's material sourcing contracts. When Benedetti told Adrian, Adrian called. "You were right," he said. "About which part?" she said. "All of it," he said. She didn't say "I know," though she thought it. She said, "How's the arm?" "Better," he said. "Dr. Sloan says another 4 weeks of therapy, and I should have close to full function." "Good," she said. There was a pause between them. Not an uncomfortable pause, the kind that develops between people who have moved past the need to fill silence with noise. "The Foundation's attorney sent me the board composition proposal," Adrian said. "You put Dr. Sloan on the medical advisory board." "She earned it," Elena said. "She's the one who went into that room with armed guards in the hallway and removed 9 strands of poison thread because she decided it was her professional responsibility." "She did," Adrian said. "I've been thinking about that. About the people who showed up when it mattered who you were, where you came from, what it cost you." He paused. "I spent 20 years surrounding myself with people I paid for loyalty. I had one person in my house who owed me nothing and told me the truth." Elena said, "You had more than one. You just weren't looking at the right people." He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't." The foundation was incorporated on a Monday in early March, 63 days after Raymond's arrest. Its official name was the Patricia Brooks Worker Safety Foundation. Its first program, free toxic exposure health screenings for garment workers, dock workers, and industrial canvas employees across the greater Chicago area, was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks. Elena attended the incorporation signing at the attorney's office. She wore her own clothes for the first time in months, not the gray uniform, not borrowed things, but her own coat and her own shoes and her own expression, which was the particular expression of someone who has built something real out of something terrible and is standing in front of it trying to understand how they got there. Adrian was at the signing. His left arm was out of the sling. He moved it carefully, with the conscious attention of someone relearning a range of motion that had nearly been stolen from him permanently. After the signing, they stood outside in the cold March air. "She would have been 61 this year," Elena said. "My mother, I know," he said. He had looked it up. He did not explain how he knew, and she did not ask. "She never asked for much," Elena said. "She just asked for the work to be safe and for someone to listen when it wasn't. That's all she ever asked." She looked at the foundation documents in her hands. "This is what listening looks like when it comes 20 years too late, but it's still listening." Adrian said nothing. He stood beside her in the cold and let her have the moment without filling it with anything. That, she thought, was something he had learned. Not a natural instinct, she had watched him learn it. Over weeks of conversations in early morning rooms, the slow, deliberate practice of a man teaching himself that presence did not require action. That sometimes the most powerful thing available to you was simply staying. A taxi came around the corner. She had called it herself. She did not let him send a car. She picked up her bag. "The first screening clinic is in 6 weeks, she said. "In the Pilsen neighborhood. A lot of former garment workers there." She looked at him. "You should come," he asked. "The man who funded it." "As a person," she said. "Just a person who showed up." She got in the taxi. He stood on the sidewalk and watched it pull away, and he thought about what it meant to just show up as a person, without the architecture of fear and authority that had surrounded him for so long it had started to feel like his actual self. He thought it might be the hardest thing he had ever been asked to do. He thought he would try it anyway. Inside the taxi, Elena watched the city past the windows and thought about her mother's journals, 47 of them, filled with her careful, tired handwriting, every workday documented in the specific detail of a woman who had learned that the only protection available to people like her was the record they kept themselves. Those journals were now in the hands of attorney Patricia Huang, who had told Elena last week that they were, in her professional opinion, the most important evidence she had seen in 20 years of labor law practice. Patricia Brooks had spent 23 years in a workshop, breathing bad air and handling toxic thread and writing it all down in composition notebooks because she needed someone to believe her. Someone finally would. Her daughter had made sure of it. The first screening clinic opened on a Thursday morning in April, in a community center in Pilsen that smelled like old carpet and institutional coffee, and the particular kind of hope that exists in places built for people who have run out of other options. Elena arrived at 6:30, 90 minutes before the doors opened. She helped the medical volunteers arrange the intake stations. She made sure the translation materials were printed in both Spanish and Polish, because the neighborhood's former garment worker population was split between two communities that had each spent decades being told their health complaints were personal problems rather than industrial ones. She checked the documentation packets that Attorney Huang's office had prepared, each one containing a plain language explanation of the civil case, a consent form for medical record review, and a phone number for a paralegal who spoke both languages. She did all of this in her own clothes. No gray uniform, no canvas cleaning bag, no practiced invisibility. Dr. Sloan arrived at 7 and looked at the setup and said, "You've done this before." "No," Elena said. "But I watched my mother organize 3 different workplace complaints over 11 years. I paid attention." Sloan looked at her for a moment. "I believe that," she said, and went to review the medical equipment. By 8 o'clock, when the doors opened, there were 22 people already waiting outside. By noon, they had screened 63. By the time the clinic closed at 5, the number was 114 people: garment workers, dock workers, canvas repair specialists, retired factory floor employees, each of whom had spent some portion of their working life handling materials that the people profiting from their labor had decided were an acceptable risk. Acceptable for whom the records now showed clearly had never included the workers themselves. Elena sat with 12 of them individually throughout the day. Not as a medical professional, she was careful about that boundary, always directing specific health questions to Dr. Sloan or the 2 attending physicians the foundation had engaged. She sat with them as someone who understood what it meant to carry a story that powerful people had decided was not worth hearing. An older woman named Cecilia, 67 years old, had worked in the same factory as Patricia for 9 years. She recognized Patricia's name immediately when Elena mentioned it. Her eyes went soft with the recognition of someone encountering the past in an unexpected place. "Patricia Brooks," Cecilia said. "She used to bring food on Fridays. Not enough to share with everyone, but enough for the women who were working the chemical treatment station. She said we worked harder than anyone else in the building, and nobody noticed." She paused. "I always meant to find out what happened to her." "She died last July," Elena said. "Lung complications." Cecilia pressed her lips together and nodded slowly. "She knew something was wrong. She told me once, maybe 2013 or 2014, she said, 'I've been writing everything down because someday someone is going to have to believe us.'" She looked at Elena. "I'm trying to be," Elena said. Cecilia took her hand and held it for a moment without saying anything, which was worth more than most things that could have been said. And Elena held it back and let herself feel the full weight of what that meant, not just for her mother, but for the 63 names in Attorney Huang's case files, and the 114 people who had walked through the doors that day, and all the ones they hadn't reached yet. Adrian arrived at 3 in the afternoon. He came alone. No security detail, no Vincent, no organized presence. He wore a dark coat over a plain shirt, and his left arm moved carefully at his side with the deliberate attention of someone still rebuilding their range of motion. He stood at the entrance for a moment. She saw him from across the room, saw him take in the space with the particular expression of someone encountering a world they had been adjacent to their entire lives without ever actually entering. He looked uncertain. It was the most human she had ever seen him look. including the weeks he had spent dying. She crossed the room and stood beside him. "You came," she said. "You told me to," he said. "I told you to come as a person," she said. "Not as the man who funded it." "I'm working on the distinction," he said. "It's harder than it sounds." She almost smiled. "Come meet some people." She walked him through the room. She introduced him not as Adrian Moretti, not as the organization, not as the foundation's donor. She introduced him as Adrian and let each person form their own impression from there. Some of them knew his name from the news coverage of Raymond's arrest, which had been substantial and which had cast Adrian in an ambiguous light that the media had not quite resolved, simultaneously victim, cooperating witness, and former crime boss. Three categories that didn't fit neatly into a single headline. Some of them didn't know it and simply took him at face value. He shook hands carefully with his left arm. He listened more than he spoke, which Elena suspected cost him significant effort. He sat for 15 minutes with a retired dock worker named Samuel, who was 71 years old and had developed a condition in both hands that his doctors had attributed to repetitive stress for 12 years before the foundation's intake form connected it to the chemical exposure records in Claire's case files. Samuel talked about his hands, the way people talk about things they have made peace with, not without grief, but without the freshness of unprocessed pain. He described the way they felt in the morning, the specific stiffness, the way cold weather made it worse, the job he had wanted to do after retirement that his hands no longer allowed. Adrian listened to all of it. When Samuel finished, Adrian said, "I'm sorry. That is, I want you to know that I understand that's saying that doesn't fix anything." Samuel looked at him for a moment. "No," Samuel said, "it doesn't. But it's more than anyone else has said." He paused. "You going to make sure this case goes forward? The civil suit?" "Yes, whatever it requires." Samuel nodded. He looked at his hands in his lap. "Then that's something," he said. "That's a start." Adrian came to find Elena at 4 o'clock. She was reviewing intake forms with one of the clinic volunteers. "I need to tell you something," he said. She stepped aside with him. "What?" "Raymond's cooperation agreement came through this morning. His attorneys accepted the terms. He's going to testify against the network in exchange for a 15-year sentence instead of 25. He paused. "Part of his testimony covers the factory, the specific executives who buried the safety complaints, the operations manager who wrote the memo about monitoring employees rather than fixing the problem. 3 of them are being charged with criminal negligence resulting in bodily harm." Elena was very still. "Criminal charges," she said. "Not just civil." "Criminal," he said. Claire's team pushed for it. They argued that the internal memo from 2014, the one explicitly choosing concealment over safety review, constitutes criminal negligence under Illinois statute. The federal prosecutors agreed. She looked at him and did not speak for a long moment. "The operations manager," she said, "the one who wrote the memo." "What's his name?" "Gerald Watts," Adrian said. "He retired in 2019. He's been living in Scottsdale." "My mother filed her last complaint in 2016, Elena said. "Gerald Watts was the person who received it. His name is on the acknowledgement form." She kept a copy. She looked at the room full of workers, the medical volunteers, the intake station's doctor. Sloan moving between patients with the focused efficiency of someone doing exactly the work she was built for. She kept every copy of everything. "I know," Adrian said. "Huang is using all 47 journals." Elena pressed both hands flat against her sides. She breathed through it the particular grief of a truth arriving too late to save the person who needed it most, but not too late to matter. Not too late to protect the people who were still here. She was right, Elena said. She said someday someone would have to believe them. "A woman named Cecilia told me that today." She looked at Adrian. "My mother was right." "Yes," he said, "she was." The room continued around them, forms being filled, blood pressure readings being taken. A volunteer explaining the civil suit timeline to a cluster of retired dock workers who were all nodding with the focused attention of people who have spent years waiting for someone to take their side of a story seriously. Elena said, "Do you understand what this room is?" "Tell me," he said. "This is what it looks like when the people at the bottom of everything finally get taken seriously. Not charity. Not someone feeling guilty and throwing money at a problem. Actually taken seriously. Listened to, believed." She looked at him. "This is what should have been happening for 30 years. "I know it should have," he said. "Your organization," she said. "The parts that are converting to worker cooperatives. The dock company. The logistics operation. Are they actually going to work? Or is it just the legal structure changing while the power structure stays the same?" He looked at her steadily. Benedetti's board held its first vote last week. They voted to raise the minimum hourly rate for dock workers by $4. Benedetti tried to argue it should be phased in over 2 years. He paused. The board voted him down. It goes into effect next month. Elena raised an eyebrow. He's learning, Adrian said. Good, she said. That's what it's supposed to feel like. The twist came 2 weeks later, and Elena did not see it coming. Attorney Huang called her on a Monday morning with a voice that was careful in a way Elena had learned to read as the register just before significant news. I need to tell you something about the civil case, Huang said. Tell me. We've been going through the factory's financial records as part of discovery. The accounts, the insurance payments, the materials purchasing history. She paused. Elena, the factory's primary liability insurer, the company that has been responsible for workers' compensation claims for the past 20 years, is a holding company. Okay, Elena said. The holding company's beneficial ownership structure runs through 3 shell corporations, Huang said. We traced it this week. The ultimate beneficial owner of the insurance holding company was Raymond DeLuca. The silence on Elena's end lasted 4 full seconds. Raymond, she said. Raymond DeLuca owned the liability insurer, Huang said. Which means every time a worker at that factory filed a health claim, every time a complaint was assessed and denied, every time the insurance company determined that the factory bore no liability for employee health conditions, that determination was being made by a company that Raymond owned. He had every financial incentive to ensure the claims were denied, and he had the authority to make it happen. Elena sat down. She was in Foundation's small office, a rented space 2 blocks from the community center, her desk covered in intake forms and medical records, and the kind of organized working clutter that meant something real was being built. She sat in her chair and felt the full shape of it expand in her mind. Raymond had not just tried to kill Adrian. Raymond had been profiting for years from the suffering of people like her mother. The conspiracy to kill Adrian was the visible piece, the dramatic piece, the piece that made newspaper headlines and federal charges. But underneath it, running quietly for decades, was a different kind of crime. The quiet kind, the kind that killed people slowly, and called it bad luck and denied the claims and paid the executives bonuses for keeping the numbers clean. How much did he make from the denied claims? Elena asked. Over the full 20-year period, our estimate is between $4 and $8 million in saved insurance payouts. Workers whose claims were denied, conditions that were classified as non-occupational, lawsuits that were settled for a fraction of their value because the claimants couldn't afford to fight. Huang paused. Elena, this changes the civil case significantly. Raymond is a defendant now. His assets, the ones the federal government hasn't already frozen, are potentially available to the plaintiffs. Elena said the workers. The workers, Huang confirmed. She ended the call and sat in the quiet office for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called Adrian. He answered on the second ring. Raymond owned the factory's liability insurer, she said without preamble. There was a pause. Say that again, he said. She said it again. The silence on his end was the specific silence of a man processing something that reorients everything he thought he understood about a situation he believed he had already fully mapped. She had heard that silence before in the medical suite at 4 a.m. when the toxicology report came back. The silence of a floor dropping away. He was collecting from both ends, Adrian said. His voice was very quiet. Yes, Elena said. He was profiting from the network he built, the illegal imports, the bribes, the contracts. And he was simultaneously profiting from the human cost of that network. The sick workers, the denied claims, the buried complaints. He owned the company that was supposed to protect them. And he sat in that chair beside my bed, Adrian said, and held my hand. Yes, Elena said. Adrian said nothing for a long moment. The assets, he said finally. Whatever is recoverable from Raymond's holdings after the federal seizure, make sure Huang knows that I will support every legal effort to get it to the workers. I will testify if it helps. I will provide any financial documentation from my own records that establishes the network structure. He paused. Raymond spent 20 years teaching me to identify betrayal before it forms. He was right that it's a useful skill. He was wrong that he had taught me everything there was to know about it. He underestimated what you were capable of, Elena said. He underestimated both of us, Adrian said. She heard, on his end, the sound of him moving, the careful, deliberate movement of a man whose shoulder was healing but not yet healed, navigating outside the physical world with the conscious attention that injury enforces. Yes, thank you, he said, not for saving my life, for not letting me stop at saving my life. She held the phone for a moment. My mother would have liked you, she said. She had no patience for powerful men. But she had enormous patience for people who were willing to be wrong out loud and then do something about it. He said, I'll take that. She said, you should. 18 months after the night Elena knocked on Adrian Moretti's door with a canvas cleaning bag and told a dying crime boss that his stitches were poisoning him, she stood at the front of a conference room at Northwestern Memorial Hospital and looked out at 230 physicians, hospital administrators, labor inspectors, factory owners, and former textile workers. She was wearing a dark blazer over a white shirt. Her hair was pulled back. She had notes on the lectern in front of her, but she did not look at them. The protocol I'm presenting today, she said, requires medical teams to verify the source, manufacturer batch number, and chain of custody for every surgical material used in any procedure classified as high risk. It requires this documentation to be completed before the procedure begins, reviewed by a second physician, and retained in the patient's permanent record. She paused. It sounds like an administrative inconvenience. It is, in fact, the difference between life and death for a specific category of patient, the category of patient who has enemies with access to surgical suites. The room was very quiet. I am not a physician, she said. I am a former maid and the daughter of a seamstress who spent 23 years handling materials that were slowly damaging her lungs while the people responsible for her safety chose paperwork over accountability. She paused. The knowledge that led me to identify a contaminated surgical suture did not come from a medical school. It came from a workshop in Chicago's industrial district where my mother repaired boat covers and taught me that the way a thread behaves tells you everything about what it's made of and what it's been treated with. She looked at the room. 20 surgeons examined the patient I'm describing. They had more education, more authority, more resources, and more professional experience than I will ever have. They did not find the problem. Not because they were incompetent, because they had already decided that the person pointing at it was not worth listening to. She let that sit for a moment. The protocol I'm proposing today is not primarily a medical protocol. It is an accountability protocol. It requires people in positions of authority to listen to information regardless of the credential attached to it. She stepped back from the lectern. It is named the Patricia Brooks Verification Standard, she said, after my mother, who spent 23 years asking to be believed and was not until it was too late for her, but not too late for the people who come after her. The room was silent for a moment after she finished. Then someone in the third row began to applaud. Then someone else. Within 30 seconds, the entire room was on its feet, and Elena stood at the front of it and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel for a very long time, not pride exactly, which was too small a word, but something adjacent to it. The particular feeling of a person who has particular something heavy for a long time and has finally put it down in a place where it can be useful. Adrian was in the back of the room. He had come alone, the way he came to the clinic, no security, no organized presence, just a man in a coat sitting in a folding chair in the back row of an auditorium. His left arm was fully functional now. Dr. Sloan had cleared him 3 weeks earlier with the specific satisfaction of a surgeon whose work had succeeded completely, which was the best kind of satisfaction available in her profession. After the room cleared, he came to find her at the lectern. 20 surgeons, he said. 20 surgeons, she confirmed. And a maid, he said. And a maid, she said, who grew up in a workshop and paid attention. He looked at her the way he had looked at her that first night in the medical suite, but completely differently. Then he had looked at her with the registering assessment of a man deciding how much weight to give an unexpected variable. Now he looked at her the way people look at someone whose full dimensions they have finally finished discovering and find themselves genuinely surprised by. What's next, he said. The protocol gets submitted for hospital adoption next week, she said. Huang's team files the expanded civil suit against Raymond's insurance holding company on Friday. The foundation's second clinic opens in back of the yards in 6 weeks. She paused. I start the occupational health certificate program at UIC in September. Going back to school, he said, going for the first time, she said. I couldn't afford it before. And the foundation will cover. The foundation has a scholarship program for staff pursuing relevant credentials, she said. I helped write the eligibility requirements. I made sure it covered exactly my situation. She looked at him. I'm not taking your money personally. I'm taking the foundation's money, which exists to do exactly this. There's a difference, he almost smiled. There is, he said. I'm learning to see it. They walked out of the hospital together and stood on the sidewalk in the October air. 18 months from the night, everything changed. His shoulder was healed. Her debt was resolved not by his direct gift, which she had insisted on converting into a documented foundation expense, but by the structured arrangement she had negotiated herself, which felt different and mattered that it felt different. The workers' civil case was moving. The criminal charges were proceeding. Raymond DeLuca was in federal custody awaiting sentencing. Nathan Caldwell had received 11 years. The organization Adrian had spent his adult life building was smaller and cleaner and governed by people who had a stake in it. The workshop where Patricia Brooks had repaired industrial canvas for 23 years had been converted, with foundation funding and community labor, into a training center for workers pursuing occupational safety certifications. On the wall, inside a sealed evidence frame, hung a short piece of black braided thread, 12-ply maritime nylon diamond braid industrial dye, the specific fragment that had been removed from Adrian's shoulder on a November morning while the city slept. Beneath it, in Patricia Brooks's handwriting reproduced from one of her 47 journals, were the words she had written in 2014, the year Gerald Watts received her third complaint and reclassified it as resolved. I am writing this down because someday someone will have to believe us. Someone had. You know what I keep thinking about, Adrian said on the sidewalk outside the hospital. Tell me, Elena said, that first night, when you knocked on my door. He looked at the street. You had every reason to stay quiet. You needed that job. You had debt. You were in a house full of armed men, and you had no protection and no leverage and no reason to believe I would listen to you. He paused. Why did you do it? She considered the question honestly, the way she always considered questions, not reaching for the clean answer, but looking for the true one. Because my mother kept writing in those journals every day. For 11 years, even when nobody was reading them, she said. Because she believed the record mattered even when no one was paying attention. And I decided, standing in that hallway, that I was not going to be a person who saw something true and stayed quiet about it, because the room was full of people more powerful than me. She looked at him. I had watched what that choice cost her. I was not going to make it again. He was quiet for a moment. She would have been proud of you, he said. She would have been furious that it took this long and this much, Elena said. But yes, after the fury proud. A taxi came around the corner. She did not call it this time. He had called it, and she had let him, because some things were worth choosing to accept, and the trick was knowing which ones. She picked up her bag. Saturday, she said. The foundation board meeting. You're not on the board, but you said you'd observe. I'll be there, he said. On time, she said. Not fashionably late. On time, he said. She got in the taxi. He stood on the sidewalk and watched it until it turned the corner, and then he stood there a moment longer, in the October air. A man who had survived a bullet and 9 strands of poison in the deepest betrayal of his adult life, and who was now, for the first time, building something that did not require anyone's fear to hold it together. The smallest overlooked detail had unraveled the most powerful lie. And the woman everyone overlooked had changed everything, not because she was extraordinary, but because she had refused, in the face of every reason to stay silent, to stop telling the truth.